Thank you, Monica, for having me, and thank you to all the organizers for setting this up. I've certainly enjoyed the lectures in this series that I've been able to attend. And today I want to talk about my meeting with a psalm, or with a psalter, rather, and that is a psalter I met inside the binding of a thesaurus, or a Greek dictionary. And it's a sneak preview at some new fragments of an Old English Gloss Psalter. So a publication is in the pipeline, as they say, and you're getting a sneak preview at what I found in that thesaurus. So I'll start with a very brief introduction to Old English Gloss Psalters, then we'll move to the newly discovered fragments of an Old English Gloss Psalter inside that binding of the thesaurus. So I'll show them to you. I'll point out some distinctive features of those fragments, and then I'll try and contextualize those new fragments by looking at how they are connected to all these gloss psalters that we already know. And I'll conclude with some words about provenance. Where does that psalter come from, and how did it end up in a book binding, which is currently in the Netherlands? But we'll start with the Old English Gloss Psalters. Now, I don't need to tell this audience that the Psalter was an important document in the Middle Ages. It was a text that was widely read. Of course, all of these nuns and monks had to read the Psalter and the Psalms on a daily basis. But as Ulrich Blom points out in his excellent book, Glossing the Psalms, the Psalter was also an educational text. It was one of the most studied texts of the Middle Ages. And it played a role in education as well. And one way in which we can see that is the fact that often these psalters could be glossed, either with an explanatory gloss or simply a linguistic gloss, providing a translation of the Latin words into a vernacular language. Ulrich Blom's book deals with various vernaculars in Western Europe. I will be looking at Old English glosses to psalters in particular. Old English, for those of you who are unfamiliar with that, is the English vernacular of the early Middle Ages, so spoken roughly between 450 and 1150. And we have quite some Old English gloss psalters. In fact, we have at least 14 of them. We know them by their initials. We call them A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N. There's also an O, that's a very late Old English psalter with sporadic glosses, and we've also got P, which is the Paris psalter, which has a prose translation rather than an Old English gloss. Now, if you look at these Old English gloss psalters, you can already see that there's quite some variety in the manner in which they are carried out. So we can see that some of them come with rich illustrations, some of them are not illustrated, some of them come with different color ink, and so on and so forth. And I want to share some of the richness of these various Old English gloss psalters with you. So I've got some slides which show you how some of these psalters do the same thing, but they do it in different ways. So they all give the Latin psalter with an Old English gloss, usually interlinear gloss, so between the lines, but they do so in different ways. So there's some variation between these gloss psalters. So for instance, the psalter on the left gives an interlinear Old English gloss in a red ink. The Latin is in the black ink, and you can see that for every Latin word, there is an individual Old English gloss. So we have nunc, which is Latin for now, and then you've got Old English nu, you've got dominum, and then you've got dricht or drichten, Lord. Omnes, that's all in Latin, and eala in Old English. So that's a nice interlinear gloss, word for word translation of the Latin psalter text. It's the Winchcombe Psalter, or the C Psalter. On the right, you see the Royal Psalter, or D, which has a different kind of gloss, or at least it has the interlinear Old English glosses to Latin words, but it also has some marginal explanatory glosses in Latin. Two other psalters. On the left, we have the Vespasian Psalter, written in the 8th century. That is, the Latin text is from the 8th century. And then a later hand in the 9th century has added an Old English gloss later on. So you can see that again, an interlinear word-for-word gloss, but this time it was added later on by a different hand. On the right, you see what is a very planned out Psalter, which is the Erdwine Psalter, which gives the three Latin versions of the Psalter side by side. So we have the Hebraicum on the left, in the middle we have the Romanum, and on the right we have the Gallicanum version of the Latin Psalter. And then it is glossed in different ways. So the Hebraicum on the left is glossed with some Anglo-Norman glosses. The one in the middle, the Romanum text, is glossed with Old English glosses. And on the right, that is the Gallicanum Psalter, has explanatory Latin glosses. So that's a completely different kind of gloss Psalter, but it's still an Old English glossed Psalter. So again, there's quite some variation. A great introduction to the Old English Psalters is this book called The Anglo-Saxon Psalter by Jane Toswell. Just some more variation in terms of how the gloss is executed. So occasionally a glossator would give more than one gloss, more than one translation of a Latin word. So, for instance, on the left, you can see the Arundel Psalter, or H. And for the Latin word dormitationem, sleep, it gives three Old English words. So, Knapunge, and then the abbreviation for vel, which means or, slap, or rest. So, a nap, sleep, or rest. I hope those words are not necessary for you right now. On the right, you see yet a different kind of gloss technique, which is found in the Lambeth Psalter, or I gloss Psalter, where you can see that not only has the glossator added Old English translations of the Latin words, they've also added dot glosses or syntactic dot glosses underneath the Latin text. So, for instance, if we read the last bit of that sentence, the Latin says Psalm nomini domini altissimi, which is I sing the name of the highest Lord. The Old English gloss reads Ich singe naman drichnes das Herstam, and then the dots underneath tell you what the right order is in the Old English. So you can see that each singer, that has one dot, so that's the first word. So each singer, I sing, namon, the name, that's 2 points underneath the Latin word. And then the next word is not drichnes, because that has 4 dots underneath. The next word needs to be das Herstam, the highest, because that has 3 dots underneath the Latin word. So in Old English, you would have said, Ich singe naman das Herstam drichnes. So the dots provide you the correct word order, if you like. So I sing the name of the highest Lord, rather than I sing the name of the Lord the highest. That doesn't make any sense in either Old or Modern English. So we've already seen that these gloss psalters may differ in terms of how they decorate the manuscripts, how they present the text on the page. We've seen different glossing techniques. What's also interesting about these Old English gloss psalters is that the Old English gloss can differ depending on dialect, depending on the time in which the gloss was made, in terms of word choice, and so on and so forth. So to demonstrate those 3 points, those 3 last points, I've taken the same psalm verse and then I've looked at 4 different Old English gloss psalters and see what happens. So the psalm verse is, you are truly the same and your years will not fail. Psalm 101, 28, according to the Vulgate reckoning. The Vespasian Psalter writes this gloss, Thu sorgliche se ilka earth, antier dine springath. The Winchcombe Psalter gives a similar kind of translation. So, Thu sorgliche se ilka earth, antier dine ne ateriath. The Royal Psalter does this, and the Lambeth Psalter does this. Now, philologists love this kind of stuff because you can compare these different glosses to this same Latin line, and you can see all sorts of differences, and these differences are interesting. So, for instance, we can see that the Royal Psalter, for instance, does not always gloss common words like who, and autem. Apparently, the glossator thought, well, if you don't know what the Latin word tu means by the time that you get to Psalm 101, you're doing something wrong. So I'm not going to translate tu for you anymore. So he didn't give a gloss for that. And the same goes for autem. So that's one difference. What words do you gloss? What words don't you gloss? I'll try and keep the Old English linguistics to a minimum, but I will point out that some of these Old English glosses also differ in terms of dialect. So the Vespasian Psalter and Winchcombe Psalter give a dialect form of the word yer, which is the Mercian dialect form. In the Royal Psalter, we can see the West Saxon dialect form with palatal diphthongization, yer. So that's a dialect difference. Of course, what we can also see in these Old English gloss psalters is the Old English language changing over time. So in the Vespasian Psalter, the Winchcombe Psalter, and the Royal Psalter, we can see that the word yer has an unmarked plural form. That is according to Old English grammar rules, if you like. But in Lambeth Psalter, you can see a later form, which is influenced by analogy. It has the S plural, like it has today. So today we say years. So the Lambeth Psalter version of ani being yares already is looking towards Modern English years, if you like, whereas the other three psalters do it according to the Old English grammar ways, as you would get in an introduction to Old English. Finally, what we can see is that these four psalters differ in terms of how they pick the words which they use to translate certain Latin terms. So we can see a difference between aspringath, ateorath, yeteorath, and ateoriath. So that's also something that makes these gloss psalters interesting. They differ in terms of the translation choices that they make. Of course, once you have different versions of the same text, and they differ in some respects, but they are also very similar in other respects, what we like to do is make stemmas and think about the relationship between these gloss psalters, which according to Philip Pulciano is under lively discussion. And it still is. People are trying to figure out how these various gloss psalters relate to one another. And generally, we do distinguish between an A tradition, a D tradition, and an I tradition. And again, these letters refer to these 14 Old English gloss psalters, if you like. And people try and come up with stemmas. That's usually very difficult to do because there likely were a lot more Old English gloss psalters than the ones that we now have today. So we're missing lots of intermediate links, if you like. There must have been hundreds of these Old English gloss psalters. And so drawing direct lines between the 14 that are available to us today is very difficult. So that was a brief introduction to Old English gloss psalters. Now let's go to the sneak preview at some new or newly discovered fragments of an Old English gloss psalter. So how I met an Old English gloss psalter. It started with an email. I got an email, the kind of email that people dream of getting, which is an email which pointed out that they had found some fragment of Old English in an archive, and they sent along a picture. So this was the picture I received in an email, and they said, well, we think this is Old English. We can't read it, but perhaps you can. And then I thought, my moment has come. I can read this. Not only can I read this, I can also already tell that this is sort of 11th century judged on the script, and I can clearly see that this is indeed Old English. And so I said, okay, that's interesting. You found some Old English in a book band. I'll come over. And so I had to go to Alkmaar, which is an hour by a train from Leiden. And they said, well, we found it in a volume, which is part of a four-volume set. And so I said, okay, that's interesting. Please bring out the other 3 volumes. And they did so. And it turned out that in each of those big folio-sized volumes of what turned out to be a Greek dictionary, there were fragments of an Old English glossed psalter. This happened early 2022. Since then, I've been obsessing about these fragments and trying to figure out what they say and what they mean. And I'll take you along the ride. So one of the first steps, of course, I need to do was to figure out how these various fragments, these are spine linings, so they were on the spine of this Greek dictionary, how they fit together. So try and piece this puzzle back together. So here you can see 5 spine linings that give the text of Psalm 43. Here are 2 end leaf guards, so the things that are at the start of the book, and they give parts of Psalms 86 and 85. I was even able to reconstruct one entire bifolium using 5 of these end leaf guards. The only thing that's missing is an empty upper margin. And so what I stumbled on then is the treasure trove in the binding of a thesaurus. So in all, there were 21 fragments belonging to an Old English Gloss Psalter, 18 of which actually had text. So there are 3 which were disappointingly empty and devoid of text. The next step then, of course, was to figure out, okay, what psalms are we dealing with? What kind of Psalter text? Well, it was 11th century, so the Psalter text you would expect is the Gallican Psalter, and that was indeed what it was. It was a Gallican Psalter rather than a Romanum Psalter, and it had the text of these psalms. I won't list them all. And it turned out to be complete or partial Old English glosses to more than 500 Latin words of the Gallican Psalter. So quite a lot. The next thing you do, of course, is look at some distinctive features to figure out when was this made, where, by whom, and so on. Well, the Old English gloss was clearly an English vernacular minuscule. The Latin rubric is an uncial script, and the Latin psalm text allows us to date the manuscript to around the 11th century. So it's an Anglo-Caroline style 4 with distinctive ra ligatures, which means that it was likely written around 1050. Another distinctive feature is how the text is represented on the page, so the mise en page, as we'd like to call it. You can clearly see that it has initials in red, blue, and green, alternating not in a systematic way, but sort of random. It has a writing frame, and it's ruled for 17 lines of Latin text per folio, which, if we compare that to other Old English gloss psalters, is rather luxurious in terms of how much text goes on the page. So there's usually you have more lines per folio. And it has a distinctive 3-point punctus versus at the end of verse lines. I'll get back to all of these features because they'll turn out to be really relevant, but more on that later. So I'm going to keep you in suspense a little more. But do remember all of these little details. Another distinctive feature is the fact that it has musical annotations in a later hand. So here you can see some Anglo-Norman neumes, or at least 12th century neumes or 11th century neumes. Some language things. Of course, you also look at the language. Once you've done the text, you start analyzing the language. So it's clear that this is a typically late West Saxon text. It has palatal diphthongization. There's breaking of a before the u, so eala rather than ala. And there's absence of Anglian smoothing. It's bezeoch and not bezoch. There's some non-West Saxon archaic forms, and there are some occasional errors in the text. So, for instance, we can see that for vertutibus, rather than giving the accurate Old English translation, which would be magenum, the scribe accidentally switched around the N and the G, and so he glossed manegum, which means many. Apologies for not giving you the proper modern English translation between brackets there. So many rather than magenum, which is virtues. More dramatically, perhaps, we also have a mistranslation of the Latin. So in conspectu suo is translated as on gezichte dienen. So suo is mistranslated. The gloss represents tuo, your, but that's inaccurate. Okay, the next thing you want to do, of course, after you've looked at the text, try to figure out how these fragments fit together. After you've analyzed the text, what you want to do is figure out how does that fit with all of these other English gloss psalters that we already know. And that's when you get into the inferno, the hell of making a collation, that is comparing these 14 other Old English gloss psalters to the newly found fragments that you have. So for every Latin word or phrase, you try and find out what do the other Old English gloss psalters give. So for ex inferno, we have of helle in our Alkmaar fragment. But as you can see that of o helle is found in G, of helle is found in all the other Old English gloss psalters. Helle of is found in E. You can see that for dare neotheron, there's lots of alternative forms, right? And that allows you to sort of place that new fragment within the context of these other existing Old English gloss psalters. What you end up with is a long list of forms and how they differ and correspond to one another. I won't go into much detail. In fact, I'll just summarize this really quickly. I can tell you that the gloss in these Alkmaar fragments is close to F and G, but it's a direct copy of neither. It's also very close to D and to H and J. And again, those letters refer to these existing Old English gloss psalters. And just to prove my point, I've made screenshots of my lists of places where the Alkmaar fragments follow G but not F, where they follow F but not G, and where they follow neither F nor G, but they follow D and H and J instead. Here I'm just going to say, trust me on this, folks. The Alkmaar fragments are close to F and G, but also very close to D and H and J. I've got some very specific examples to show you. So, for instance, D and Alkmaar share some unique glosses, including one of these Latin interpretive glosses in the Royal Psalter in D. It's also found in the Alkmaar fragment. So for Sion, the Royal Psalter gave a Latin interpretive gloss, Heavenly Jerusalem, and the Alkmaar fragments do the same. It's not just the glosses that you can look at and see whether they correspond to existing Old English gloss psalters. You can also look at some of these distinctive features. So, for instance, that distinctive 3-point punctus versus, so the 3 points, sort of the semicolon and then a punctus, at the end of verse lines is something that is not only found in the Alkmaar fragments, it's also found in J. What we can also see is that the mise en page with the colored initials make the Alkmaar fragments rather similar to F, G, and H, which also have that same alteration of colored initials and sort of represent the text in a similar way. And so this allows us to place those new fragments within something of a stemma. So this is a stemma that was proposed by Seism and Seism in their edition of the Salisbury Psalter. And they pointed out that D, F, G, H, and J share so many similarities that somehow they must be related somewhere. And we can now put our Alkmaar fragments inside that stemma, either over here or over there. So that's nice. But there's more to this, because other fragments of Old English gloss psalters have been found. The N-Psalter is a fragmentary psalter. And as you'll see, this has a bearing on the Alkmaar fragments that were found. Now, the N-Psalter fragments started popping up from the 1960s onwards. So Dietz in 1968 found some in Cambridge. Derolet found some in Haarlem, the Netherlands. Gnois gave an edition of the Sondershausen fragment, which is found in Germany. And then our host and organizer, co-organizer of this series, Monika Opolinska, and two co-authors, published a very recent find in a great article in 2022, which presented us with fragments from Elbląg, Poland. And Gnois and Deole and Opolinska point out that all of these fragments once belonged to the same N-Psalter. And again, I recommend that you read all of those articles. And they came up with a number of features that all of these N-Psalter fragments share. And if you look at these features, you should already start seeing that the Alkmaar fragments fit in really nicely. So the type of script is the same. The form and color of the verse initials is the same. The form of the punctus versus, according to Gnois, the punctus versus with the semicolon and the punctus of the 3-point punctus is not a form found frequently elsewhere, if at all. It is found in all of these N-Psalter fragments, and in Alkmaar, and in J. They also pointed out that their N-Psalter fragments had a close relationship to D, F, G, and H, so that also fits. And the ruling that they describe also matches the one that I found in the Alkmaar fragments. So that's quite nice. And there are further indications that the Alkmaar fragments belong to that same N-Psalter fragment. I'll just give you, I think, three examples. One is that both N-Cambridge and Alkmaar have musical annotations in a later hand. So that's not something that is, so that's another thing that they share, musical annotations. Some of the end leaf guards in Alkmaar match the form of the ones that were found in Haarlem and Sondershausen. But most dramatically, the Haarlem fragment and the Alkmaar fragment were cut from the same bifolium. That is to say, look, this is what that original bifolium would have looked like. There are places in the text where Haarlem ends and Alkmaar takes over, and Haarlem ends and Alkmaar takes over. So I'll show you that like this. So the red text is Haarlem, the green text is Alkmaar, and you can see that essentially where Haarlem ends, Alkmaar picks up. And that happens 3 times, as you would expect if they come from the same bifolium, right? So in other words, those Alkmaar fragments do not represent some 15th or 16th Aldings glossed psalter. It's part of the same N-Psalter that Dietz and Deroulé and Gnois and Monika Opolinska have already been editing. So we have further pieces of the puzzle, right? Which brings me to provenance. So that brings in a completely different angle, which is how do fragments of one and the same N-Psalter, one and the same psalter, end up in Cambridge, Haarlem, Sondershausen, Elbląg, and Alkmaar? Because these places are quite far apart, as you can see, with the exception of Haarlem and Alkmaar, which are quite close by, actually. And to figure that out, of course, we need to look at the host volumes. In what kind of books were these fragments found? Now, sadly, for Cambridge, that host volume was not recorded. The same goes for Haarlem, but I think I found it. The same goes for Sondershausen. But Monika Opolinska, in their edition from 2022, note that the host volume for those fragments was still there. And in fact, I think the fragments were still in there. And of course, the same goes for Alkmaar. And those host volumes can tell us a bit more about how these fragments ended up in these different places and why they're popping up now. I'll very briefly summarize what Opolinska et al. Have said. Again, I would suggest that you read the article. It's quite cool. They point out that these fragments that they found were used as end-leaf guards of a Hebrew grammar published in 1600, and it was owned by Samuel Meijenreis, a Polish gentleman, who died in 1604. So that gives us a nice window of 1600 to 1604. Intriguingly, Mayenreis studied here in Leiden between December 1600 and April 1602 under Francis Junius Senior, who was professor of theology, who also taught Hebrew. So did Mayenreis buy his Hebrew grammar because he was studying in Leiden under Francis Junius Senior? Who knows? We do know that he defended his thesis on the Old and New Covenant under the supervision of Junius on the 19th of January, 1602. So potentially that gives us a window of 1600, 1602. But what about the Alkmaar fragments? Well, they're found in a Thesaurus Graeca, so a Greek dictionary, as end-leaf guards and spine linings. Sadly, that book is not dated, except for the fact that it's probably after 1580, and it's not located. So that doesn't really help us much. But luckily, it was fitted with fly leaves, which had watermarks, which allow us to date the binding of the book to around 1600. So that's around the same time as Mayenreis was buying his Hebrew grammar. This book, this 4-volume set, once belonged to the public library of Alkmaar. And fortunately, I found out that there is some documentation which tells us about the history of that book. Very long story, but I'll just briefly summarize by saying that this book was bought in Leiden around 4 June 1601. The patrons of the municipal library of Alkmaar, so the Librairie of Alkmaar, sent 2 people to Leiden to buy lots of books because there was a book auction going on at the time. These people went to Leiden and they bought lots of books, some at the auction, some at other bookshops. And this was one of the books they bought, not at the auction, but at some other bookshop. So Leiden, 1601. So that brings us nice to Mayenreis, who was a student of Leiden. Right? Now I told you that I possibly found the host volume of the Haarlem fragment, which is in the Haarlem archive, which happened to have a book with a very similar binding, like the Alkmaar books, which is a limp parchment binding. It had fly leaves with similar watermarks, and it matches an item of the book auction of the 4th of June, 1601 in Leiden. So I think I may have found the Haarlem host volume as well. And so that changes our picture a bit about the provenance. So if I'm correct about the Haarlem host volume, that was bought in Leiden in 1601. The Alkmaar host volume was certainly bought in Leiden in 1601. The Elblong host volume was bought by a student who was in Leiden between 1600 and 1602. So I think we can add one more little mark on our map, which is Leiden, 1600. I think I've got 5 more minutes to go in case people are looking at the time. So around 1600, this Psalter was in a Leiden bookbinder's workshop, and it ended up in various books, and these books ended up in various places. But what about the manuscript itself? Where is that manuscript from? We already noted that it has connections to D, F, G, H, and J in terms of what it looks like and the gloss relationship. And so that potentially tells us where it's from, because D, F, G, H, and J, according to an overview by Philip Pulciano, all come from Winchester, or probably from just Winchester, or almost certainly from Winchester, which to me makes it likely that the Alkmaar fragments and the N-Psalter probably came from Winchester as well. That leads me to a final question of how an 11th century Orleans gloss Psalter from Winchester ended up in a Leiden bookbinder's workshop around 1600. Right, so we have another mark on our map. Now, there's a very boring explanation, which is simply that confiscated books from England were shipped to the continent for bookbinders and soap sellers, as John Bale famously points out, he writes about the dissolution of the monasteries and how people will start selling off the libraries and the books. And he writes about some they sold to the grocer and soap sellers, so they could use parchment to wrap soap in, and some they sent over the sea to the bookbinders, not in a small number, but at times whole ships full, to the wondering of the foreign nations. So John Bill writes about how shiploads of English manuscripts were shipped to the continent for bookbinders, because they could use that scrap parchment as some sort of cheap material to strengthen their book bindings. That's the boring explanation. And there's also a more exciting explanation, which was first proposed by Helmut Gnois, and there's a much better and fuller discussion in Opolinska et al. 2022, and that is that this Psalter may be the Psalter that belonged to Gunhild. Gunhild was the sister of King Harold Gottmanson, who, after the Norman conquest, fled to Flanders, and that she dies in Bruges in 1087 and leaves various treasures to the Saint Donatus or Saint Donas community, including a Psalter with Old English glosses, which is described as the Psalterium Gunhildis Expositum in Anglico in a library catalogue from the 13th century. You can see that here. It's the third item on this list. Now, the last witness to the Gunhild Psalter was Jacques de Meyer, who wrote a historiographical work about Flanders. And he also writes about Gunhild ending up in Bruges, and he describes how she left the church of Saint Donatus, among other things, a Psalter, which today we still call the Gunhild Psalter, certainly in Latin, but with a translation in the Saxon language, which no one here can quite understand. Apparently by 1561, Jacques de Meyer still knew about the Gunhild Psalter and its illegible Saxon glosses. Now, Opolinska et al. Suggests that this Gunhild Psalter, which was never seen again, may have been lost when the church of St. Donatus was destroyed in 1804. We no longer have it. Jacques de Meyer is the last one to have seen it, or at least written down that he'd seen it. But of course, 1804 brings us is way too late for the Leiden bookbinders workshop in 1600. And there may be another moment during which the Gunhild Psalter was lost, and that is the Calvinist takeover of Bruges in 1578 to 1584. In 1578, the Calvinists take over Bruges, and one of the things that they do is they found a public library by confiscating books from monasteries and churches. And the books of the St. Donatus community were confiscated on the 13th of December, 1580, with the purpose of either filling that public library, so the best books were to be taken from the library to stock the public library, but the superfluous ones, so the ones that they couldn't use for the public library, they were to be sold. Now, if there were more people like Jacques de Meyer who couldn't read the Old English glosses, then I imagine that the Gunhild Psalter was one of those superfluous books that were sold off, potentially to a bookbinder who ended up in Leiden. Who knows? It's all hypothesis, right? That brings me to my conclusion. What I've tried to convince you of today is that the 11th century N-Psalter likely came from Winchester. Then that N-Psalter, like Gnois has suggested and Opolinska et al. have pointed out, could possibly be the Gunhild Psalter, which was last seen in Bruges in 1561. It ends up in a Leiden bookbinder's workshop around 1600, and fragments that were bound in various books end up in Cambridge, Haarlem, Sondershausen, Elbląg, and Alkmaar, and that's where we're finding them now. Now, of course, this is not the end of the story. The story can be continued, and in fact will be continued, because there's still some of things that I haven't talked about yet, like piecing these fragments back together, bringing them back, perhaps digitally, and perhaps looking at what that N-Psalter may have looked like, reconstructing it in terms of the bifolia and the folia and the choirs and how long it may have been. And I expect that this will be part of the November lecture of this series by Monika Opolinska. And I'm looking forward to hearing about the next steps. For now, though, this is what I've had to say about those new fragments and my meeting with an Orleans Gloss Psalter. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. Hopefully, you'll be able to read all of this, what I've said, in an article which is currently under review. So hopefully it will be accepted and you'll be able to read it. With that, thank you for listening.